Okay, I think that the session has started. It's 1 past 6,
Yes.
so I think our tech team is ready with video. I would like them to wait a little bit when I introduce you. Yeah, so I do know is Robin Mientjes graduated from the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague 9 years ago already.
Oh, don't
And
remind me.
you're currently senior designer at Scandinavian Design Group. Is that's a small, middle-sized, big kind
40
of?
people.
It's a
40 people. Half of it all graphic design. Then I'm the
Mhm.
only type designer. And then there's a bunch of strategy people and yeah, more. Like we have gigantic corporate clients, so it's a bunch of people that are
Oh.
really into talking to big clients.
And are you then involved in creating custom typefaces for those clients?
Yes, I have a few of them on my site,
Oh,
and
fascinating.
there's always a bunch of them going on. But yeah, that's what we largely do for some really corporate stuff, banks and insurance companies and stuff like that.
So that's a tiny typeco that people can visit after this
Yeah, there's I
after
think
this
5
talk.
projects that I've put up from over the years. So
Nice, nice, nice. All right. So, for people coming in, thank you for attending the sessions. I specifically asked to introduce Robin because I'm a big fan. I was just showing. I hope I can show them properly. Up. This is Motorcycle. That's the Tower, and that's Motorcycle. The Crucible is one of my favorite bands. And when you open up this package and you check the credits, is the first album where I see that type by no font, they call it font, whatever, by Robin Mientjes. So it's one of the only rock albums. I don't know any other rock album where the type designer gets credited. So we will discuss this after the presentation because it's a nice story. But I think that we are about to start the video. So if the volunteer can start it, then we can enjoy the presentation.
Hi, I'm Robin. I design type for the Tiny Type Co. and I'm a senior designer at Scandinavian Design Group in Oslo, Norway. I want to talk a little bit about using historic material in type design. I've been thinking a lot about what it means to make revivals, how much it influences our view of type, and what lessons we can learn from historic material that ultimately have greater value than specific designs. To be very, very brief, and give away the whole talk, I'm looking at hero worship and craft as craft. I'm questioning historic survivor bias, and I'm looking into alternatives. A curious person takes things apart to see what makes them click. There are lots of things that we use every day that we are completely used to, that we just accept. We don't challenge or explore what those things are, how they work, or how they work that way. You can take apart alarm clocks, songs, or even chairs. You might not always be able to put them back together, but you'll often learn a lot. What I want to take apart is the way we use historic materials. Revivals are an institution in type design. We make copies of older designs for new media and explore what the original shapes really were like. We also use this historic material as reference for quality and as a baseline for certain rules. Some of these rules have slowly developed and merged fully into our craft. Rhythm, proportion, consistency, influence of our tools on our work, appropriateness of the medium. Gerrit Noordzij's The Stroke provides a theory of type design that is entirely founded on the tools used to produce calligraphy and type. That model abstracts away individual actors and focuses on the methods and history of the forms, to the point that the evolution of our letter forms is only logical when you understand how they were created. Frank Blokland's research into formalized unitized type design is equally based on the craft, rather than on a specific example that fits the model. He finds logic in the actual production of the metal type, rather than only in the more abstract design process. The production is the design. And this goes way back. He finds these examples of unified widths in 1472, and this in its own way brings a deeper understanding to the history of the craft. But we also have the things we call revivals, and what they are burdened with is baggage, the particulars of the originals, the consistent bias that history shows for certain people and certain work, and hero worship. There are several problems to discuss. The particulars of the specific designs can distract from the design principles. When we call Garamont an old style or Renaissance typeface, there are certain expectations in the category language. Formally, we expect relatively low stroke contrast, a contrast angle of about 30 degrees, bracketed serifs, and capitals with varying widths. When we, however, ask for a Garamont or Garalde, as the category is also known, we're introducing a lot of complications. The works by his contemporaries, people like Guillaume Le Bay, Pierre Holtin, and Robert Grandjean, were of the same category language, and they definitely knew each other. They worked in the same field, on the same kind of products. To view Garamont's work in isolation would not educate a type designer to be. Another known problem is that there is no authoritative, single reference Garamont typeface. For example, every design was made to a specific size. That's the nature of lead type. And in our eagerness to brand things with familiar names, a lot of type became called Garamont, including work by Jean Genon, 60 years after Claude Garamont had died, which almost comically does not look like Garamont's work, but which definitely became a Garamont in the eyes of typographers around the world. Even when we have a single reference design, it can be hard to say what really makes it what it is. The category was named after Garamont, but the contents within it are, very rarely, a singular Garamont. The differences become too great for it to bear the one name. Which leads us to the following conflict. The implicit survivor bias in the telling of history is damaging to the actual history of the craft. Although we've largely corrected our historic records on who designed what, we did for centuries refer to Genon's work as Garamont, to Grandjean's italics as Garamont. This simplified version of history removes all the typefaces that didn't make it for whatever reason. Garamont worked during an incredibly busy period in type history, and we have to assume a lot of that history is lost. Lost for whatever reason. We simply can't know. Lost perhaps because of an unfortunate bankruptcy, a bad reputation with the local powers, or simply used in books nobody deemed worth keeping. There is a risk of believing that only type that made it all the way to the here and now was the only type worth keeping, and that presumes a meritocracy that simply doesn't exist. Finally, hero worship creates a dramatically skewed image of type design history, where only a handful of individuals decided on the course of the craft. Claude Garamont didn't work alone in his foundry. No foundry where hot type alloy was melted was operated by the one designer, punch cutter, matrix justifier, floor sweeper, lunch chef, and also a salesman. It asks for too much to believe that he worked alone. But as a consequence of his celebrity, what we primarily have is the idea that Garamont was a singular visionary who was the sole cause of the success of his work. Hero worship also leads to unquestioning belief. This is of course an exaggerated example, and I don't know any type designers who say this. But the idea that the name Caslon has become so strong and so singular is not based on merit, but on celebrity. The various incarnations of the Caslon type foundries have had many type choices available for typographers, varying in purpose and quality. And a blanket statement like this ignores that complexity. So what did I learn from using historic sources? For my own foundry, I currently only have historic references for sale. There's a direct interpretation of some designs by Piet Zwart from the 1930s, and there's a broader interpretation or translation of Haas Caslon, paired with a sans serif that references the same era. And in these projects I learned a lot of things about the historic material I was interpreting. This may be the moment you think, hey, isn't she being a huge hypocrite? And maybe I am a hypocrite for being critical of revivals while having basically made a few. But I also believe that I got to this place of critique because of the revivals I made. There is a great value in revivals, the ones where you expose a design to a new medium, and the ones where you have to learn the internal language of the design. Monumental Grotesque does things that Piet Zwart never planned or even imagined, such as the extended language support. And designing those entirely new shapes required a lot of puzzling and resolving to understand the real idea behind the design. In my eyes, the craft of type design is industrial design more than graphic design, furniture making more than poster design. A chair, if we reduce it to its simplest purpose, only needs to keep our butt up. But we judge a chair for a lot more. The quality with which one's butt is kept up, the quality in which the chair fits the space it is placed in, the curves in the woodwork, the fabrics, and the armrests. And that sort of work, the craft of the furniture maker, ultimately is not predicated on having to look like other chairs in order to be a valid chair. There are certainly Platonic ideals to some extent that we seek to realize. Category language is an amalgamation of more than just one piece of work, but rather the entire environment in which individual pieces can exist. A chaise-longue will meaningfully differ from a dining chair. Perhaps your chair does end up looking a lot like this. I don't know. It holds the butt up. But we can judge it for the craft you invested into it and for the quality of the sitting, and we never need to compare it to other chairs. Similarly, in type design, a high contrast serif typeface with a vertical axis and pointed pen contrast has its own category language. But just as we don't need to compare every chaise-longue to the LC4 designed by Le Corbusier, Pierre Jeanneret, and Charlotte Perriand, we don't need to compare every high contrast serif with a category language from the 18th century only to Firmin Didot's works. To limit yourself to a revival may even give a false sense of security. So long as I copy this surviving design, surely I am also copying its virtues. But that presumes a lot about the original, and teaches you nothing about the reason the design looked and worked like that in the first place. Another thing I've become concerned with is the language we use. We call our projects revivals, bringing designs back to life. It's a funny choice of word, an implication, for example, that the original has died. That you are the Dr. Frankenstein who will somehow inject life into it. There is a strange claim to greatness in that. A greatness by association, maybe? Or was it on its last breath? Did we rescue a design that was dying by redrawing it? Did that save the life of the font? When a chair design is revived, people don't call it that. In furniture, if you're getting an Eames desk chair, the expensive type, but at a really low price, what you're buying is a copy. Not a homage or a revival, not a remix or a reinterpretation. And if you pretend that you came up with it, we call that a rip-off. There is honor in a cover band not pretending to be Led Zeppelin and Queen and the White Stripes. What often happens, and this is a much more related framework in my opinion, is that an idea gets translated. It gets translated from one time, place, format, ideology, technology to another. And that, by definition, changes the thing. That's the secret behind every translation. When you read a translation of a text, you now read the words of two writers. Every translation tries to make the original relevant to a new audience in its own way, with its own agenda and its own needs. A lot of type education already largely works this way. It already centers the craft, and they can judge a log like a chair. What I'm proposing is that we finally let go of our heroes. We learn more from the environments they worked in, their influences, their collaborations, and the many advancements to the craft that have come since their time, than from their individual type designs. And that is ultimately the spirit of standing on the shoulders of giants. Not pretending to be that giant or to copy it, but to embrace its role in your growth. A way I'm exploring this myself is in the form of remixes and other experiments. One such example is a bridge I tried to build between 1450 and 1950, a jump across time and type styles. When we learn about historic type, we can see certain ideas that maybe got lost to time. The upright capitals next to the cursive lowercase in this Renaissance italic, very much in the tradition of Francesco Griffo, if not in his work, which I'm not sure of, are a very interesting peculiarity. Over time this disappeared, and the capitals became italicized with the rest. But the appeal, to me, of a nice, tightly spaced lowercase, combined with these proud white capitals, felt like a wonderful, pure idea that, if I understood it correctly, did not have to remain in the Renaissance. If we were to combine those shapes with a different era of forms altogether, maybe, say, a quite rationalized grotesque from the mid-20th century, that should in theory still work. Rhythm, proportion, spacing, as long as those things are in place, a lot of doors close, sure, but some open up. And I'm willing to say that it actually works. It's fun. This is an outtake from the upcoming Tiny Grotesque. The final family ended up finding a different path, a better way to tell its own story. but the whole thing started with historic inspiration. Speaking of hero worship, Francesco Griffo, he killed his own son-in-law. Just a fun little nugget I thought I'd throw in there for you. Another example is the sort of synthesis that happens in a creative process when you try to pay homage, when you try to speak a specific category language without imitating any particular exponent of that category language. For example, this is Gagneur, a very poorly researched attempt at drawing a French Renaissance typeface from memory. I've referred to some drawings here and there when in doubt, but ultimately, it looks like none of the sources I've gathered. Sometimes complicating my job, but also, more often than not, opening up new possibilities. Of course, there is a lot of unconscious work in this, a lot of inspiration I have absorbed over the years, but that isn't invalidating. I think it is in fact quite exciting that something I drew from a gut feeling can feel so fitting to the category language. But maybe the right word for this isn't a remix, a homage, or an interpretation. Maybe this is a pastiche. Let me know down in the comments. When I take apart a typeface, I can learn a lot. I look at what it is and what it does, and I look less at who it quotes. I see English transitional forms, I see Dutch crispness, and I see the new ideas that I felt necessary to make the design mine. When I look at the official source for Dover serif text, I can still easily see where I started, but I think I took it somewhere else. I translated Edmund Thiele's Haas Caslon, itself an interpretation of historical work. It carries on a lot of tradition from the original Caslon, but it has its own charm. Adobe Caslon feels appropriately of the same age. A facsimile or copy or digital version might be a better word for what this is. It leaves a very similar impression. The capital to lowercase proportion is also maintained, and it feels a bit poetic, perhaps. So when I go back to my reference, and I see what I took from the sources, I can sometimes lose that connection. I see so many places where I inserted myself, my needs, my expectations of what the Caslon category could do today. I made a lot of corners much more acute, I made the lowercase taller relative to the capitals, I trimmed the length of the ascenders and descenders. It makes the face a little bit more matter-of-fact, a little less poetic. If those are the right words to describe what is ultimately my translation of someone else's translation. Before I wrap this up, I want to thank Indra, Amy, Sahar, Bianca, and Tanya, who made me do this, and then helped me do it. I also want to thank Anna, who's hiding behind the camera. Thank you, Anna. You can also find me online at tinytype.co, or you can find me on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for your attention.
It's fascinating that your approach to revivals is similar to some theories I had on my own, not being a type designer or anything, but like that I think the only proper way to do a revival is to try to get into the mindset of what designer was trying to do back in the day and do it with the current knowledge and current tools and so on. So there was there is one question here. Sandra asks, is there another way in English to name the Geralde group and the Doon group into the Vox ATypI classification in order to avoid the reference to a hero?
Yeah, that's a funny question because, like, in my own examples, I do have to keep bringing up these names because we've made these people the name of the image, right? We've made them
touchstones.
The category. It's like saying, well, that's a Tarantino, or that's such a Bruce Lee. It's like, no, we call those action movies or karate. It's like, no, that's a Bruce Lee. It's like, I think that's a karate movie, but whatever. Or like kung fu. But like it's like in type we've just made that incredibly normal. Like, no, that is a thing as such, and we don't call it by the era, and in some cases we don't really have a good era term for it. So we get things like transitional, which is not related to any other term of art within cultural artifacts. Like we don't talk about architecture from the same era as also being transitional. We're talking about Baroque things. Then we could talk about some of it. We could talk about Romantic era. But then what is a Romantic typeface? There are no Romantic typefaces as far as I know. Those are Baroque or transitional or from that era. So we don't really have a mapping to other artistic era terms if we're trying to borrow from somewhere, right? Like I'm constantly borrowing from other terms anyway. I'm constantly borrowing from for example, furniture design, things like that, like talking about this in a sort of, I mean, maybe I'm limiting myself with that, but like I'm trying to find other ways to say what I'm seeing, because it helps me to understand what it's for. And if we keep reducing the term to like, well, it just looks like XYZ, then it like I often describe type design to people who don't really know how it fits into culture as like being a paint designer. Like I make a really nice color, and then you make the palette, and you paint the thing, and you make something beautiful out of it. But I hope that my color is super flexible for you, and that you can make something beautiful with it. And that makes it, that is really reductive in a way, but that helps me to find other language to describe what I'm doing. If I then have to use terms like, well, that's just like, oh, it's a Garald. Like I actually don't know that anymore about Gagneux, for example. Like with Gagneux, I have so stubbornly, like I looked at some stuff and I was like, no, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't look French enough. And then I did something else. And honestly, now I'm like stuck with my own idea. And clearly there are like ideas of like, yeah, what would make it look French? But what do I know? Like, I know some French. I've been to France. Otherwise it's bullshit, right? Like I'm just kind of channeling something, finding other words to reflect on it properly. So comparing it, like finding similes and metaphors in the work I do, helps me to abstract away those narratives, those people that we've put on the pedestal. But like I said about Garamont, every time that I've discussed this topic with people who aren't in type, they've kind of had their mind blown about this idea. Like, yeah, no, Garamont, like they know that, they've seen that name. And then I tell them like, so when did he work? And how do you think that went? Do you think he was like stoking the fire, blowing, and then like, or using the bellows, right? He was pumping the bellows to melt the type lead alloy, right? But he was also buying that. He was probably going around shopping, getting all the lead. He was doing all this, right? Are we really going to believe that? It's an absurd notion. It is like saying that a movie director is the only person who made the movie. But we know now that that's not true. But about type, we've really reduced it to that sort of place. And people always find that so mind-blowing that, yeah, we've reduced the way we can talk about this completely down to the worst way to talk about it, because Garamont was of a generation. But that whole generation is rolled up into his name. And I find that awful problematic for many reasons, but like even just for people making stuff. What do you get out of that? Yeah, I know that's not an answer, Sandra. I'm so very sorry.
No, it's a very strong point. I also like your whole concept of, and this is basic to the nature of type design, is that you say we're not creating art, we're more like craftspeople, we make tools. So it's not like the finished product. Actually, you make a finished project, but the product is not finished when it leaves your hands, because some other person has to finish it, because you make the paint and they have to make the palette. I remember this one talk by Jonathan Barnbrook where he said that Exocet had been used for extreme right-wing hate group. And he says, like, I have no control of where it ends up. So what do we do with this?
I think about that a lot, actually, about the place that it ends up taking. At the same time, I do also think that that it would in a way be very comical that some Nazis pay a trans woman to use her fonts. Like I would kind of be like,
why not?
Well, you just paid my rent, you idiots. You like I love that you're putting your money where your mouth is not. That's just an interesting notion. But it is a bit scary about type, that it is indeed taken in other people's hands and that they could do whatever they do with it. But then, if you say something and it's taken out of context, the same thing also happens. And I think there is a framework of like how I write about my type and how I write about what I'm trying to accomplish with it. And I also hope kind of gives people that idea. Like I think a foundry without like a personality behind it is also harder to buy from, in my opinion. I prefer knowing what you stand for, not necessarily politically, just like, what is this? What is this for? And then I can go like, oh yeah, okay, that maps to a sensibility. And clients also, by the way, love that when you're buying fonts, that they think like, oh, there's a story behind it, there's a reason, rather than like, no, this is the trendy font, I found it on the bestseller list this week. I was like, okay. Yeah, I kind of went on a tangent there again, which is the whole topic of the whole method I make talks.
Tangents are the best. No, and
all I got, Eve.
The point you make is really interesting, because we've had not too recent complete reappraisal of Eric Gill's work because of his problematic life, and there's also been a whole thing, I'm not going to name any names, about a typeface that has been designed by an extreme right-wing like Nazi person, and then people say like, okay, and how far do you make a distinction between the person and the work, and how much do you accept from the people that you're actually paying for using their what they made?
Yeah, but that ties into like a debate that people are like still relearning and still having from scratch, like coming down to basically death of the author. And I don't really buy into that. You could argue that certain things exist outside of that person's intent, outside of the thing they made. Like a Nazi making a chair isn't making a Nazi chair, because that would be an absurd notion. Like that's really hard. Like, oh, now you're going to sit like a Nazi. But but there is also a sort of implicit support. Like when you do get these things, you have created a like, I don't know, like if you could like often I see an example of people who make excuses for people who say they're not alt-right for a while, and then slowly it's becoming clear that they are actually super alt-right. They'll say like, no, I'm gay and my boyfriend is black, so how could I be a Nazi? And then you see that over time it's like, wow, but everything you say is only being retweeted and broadcast by Nazis and loved by Nazis. It's like, if the material you do make is only hitting a particular audience, then at least have some self-reflection, right? And like, so that goes both ways. So you can see how obviously there is something beyond like separating the author. Like there is obviously an influence that we definitely recognize. We're just saying like, yeah, but I love the art so much that I want to think about the artist. I think that's really what's happening. Like you can argue, you could agree that Pablo Picasso was both like a gross creep who was into women of I think sometimes you can't even call them women, that they very much younger partners, and then also see that Guernica is an incredible piece of art showing the horror of war and recognize it as a piece of art. It does mean that like maybe that's not a great one to put on your wall, but like it does mean that largely I think like, oh, Picasso, good stuff. I don't need to like perpetuate it necessarily. You can have a look at it. I'm not going to have it on my wall. It was a bad example because if you have Guernica on your wall, I don't know why you would look into that horror every day. But
well, you have money. That's true.
Yeah, I think people are with me here.
Hear me?
I think there's other questions here that are going on, but
hold on. Yeah, people are not asking questions in the Q&A thread, so I have to scroll through the whole thing to find questions. I found another one. Hold on. Let me know. Okay. Yanni Pulka asks, do you know if Garamont and Didot and others were considered greatest in their time, or were they put on a pedestal later on by type historians and similar people?
I don't actually know that. That's part of the survivor bias thing, right? Is that we now look at, like I always give the example of Bach. It's like everybody's like, Bach, that's the best. That's the best classical music that was ever made. If you think of classical, you think of Bach, blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, he was the only guy. He's the only one who made stuff that was worth keeping. That's why he was the best. Like we just have the historic filter, the like really strangely meshed sieve of history, like takes out stuff at random. It isn't based necessarily there. Like I said, there is no such thing as meritocracy. That is an incredible presumption to think that based on everything you've seen in the world, you're like, no. But the stuff that made it to now has to be the best. It has to be. It just has to be, because that's what you want to be true. That's how we want the world to be. We want to believe that the good stuff is the surviving stuff. That like survival of the fittest means survival of the stuff I like the most. And like ultimately history is like incredibly biased, not, in an abstract way. It's incredibly biased. And so I don't exactly know who to blame for saying like this is the best, but that is a narrative that everybody recognizes, because otherwise would we have named it after them? Like I mean, maybe people disagree with that, but would we have named it after Garamont if that hadn't been such like that those tie together to me? I believe that is the same thing. The fact that we've attached that name to it, and that is like the remaining thing. There is just something that reduction is part of the filtering of history. Again, that's probably not an answer. Or was it a question?
That's great where it goes to. I'm totally fine with where this is going. I'm checking now. Finally, people have found the Q&A section in chat, so I don't have to scroll like crazy. So this question touches upon something sensitive, but it also touches upon something I'm struggling with. So I start teaching typography next semester. Another problem that I'm showing a typeline of middle-aged white dudes, because this is, of course, not because of the merits of those people, but because of the whole patriarchy providing this framework for rich white men to be promoted and even often failing upwards, and which means that other people that are non-white male don't get the same opportunities and don't have the same support and advancement. So Bianca Benedicto asks, Robin, do you work with other queer type designers or know the work of others? Because sometimes we don't know, like, if we want more diversity, we want to find those people and see, like, do they have work that we can use too?
Yeah, and first let me share a little thing, because I had a customer recently who explicitly bought a font of mine because I'm queer, because it is text of my site, maybe not necessarily text of my work. But that was an interesting thing, because I hadn't considered that somebody would buy it for that reason. But then they asked me if I think that a type foundry or type can be queer, and what that would be. And that is an interesting question, because that comes down to like what queerness and diversity stands for. And so for me, queerness as a thing is like ultimately is attitude and taking a stand against whatever norms are held. It's not specifically about the norm, but normativity. That is what is often the problem. It's not queer if nobody thinks, like people used to think that tattoos and face piercings and brightly colored hair were pretty queer signifiers, and they're not anymore. They've become part of a larger normative system, or larger set of norms. Whatever is normative, that's like a nebulous power that who knows who's really in charge. But so I thought, like, how would my foundry be queer, or how would my work be queer? And then I'm thinking, well, my releases are like tiny. I know that sounds like stupid and simplistic, but they are intentionally narrow families. Like in a way, my attitude with that is, you get what you get. I think this is a good idea. This is how I'm going to do it. This is what I know works. If you go for it, it's going to go for you. It's going to work. Trust me. And there's a sort of attitude that I think could only have come from my own queerness to dare to say, like, no, this is good enough. I know it's good. You better like it too. Like, I built it and you will come. Like, there's a sort of an attitude of like, not a, what is that? What's that? Oh, it's a good saying. In any case, it's more of a fuck you queerness than a sort of like, well, that's funky. No, I'm like, no. Queerness is almost a form of punk, depending on where it stands in society. But that requires taking a stand, and that requires a particular amount of attitude. And attitude I have plenty of. I don't necessarily make a super public thing about it, except that my website has a gigantic rainbow on top, which in case anybody missed it. But I think a lot of people simply don't share their status, because in so many places it is not accepted. And there will be companies where, like, I think you might not get away with licensing a typeface from a gay, because then there'd be trouble. Like then somebody would be really upset in Midwest America. Or I don't know, there's plenty of places in the world where that would simply not be acceptable. I'm pretty sure in Chechnya, if there's type by gay type designers, then that doesn't exist in the same way that gay people don't exist in Chechnya. They must just get like the not deaf character. They get like an empty box for every letter. But like a lot of people hide that status, and I know of like probably more queer, like broad queer term type designers, several of whom are not out with that,
Yes.
or of whom like it's technically out there, but it's not really said anywhere, and I think that's like I fully understand. I happen to just live in an incredibly, all things considered, incredibly welcoming society. But maybe that's just because people here kind of keep their mouths shut. Like in the Netherlands, it's worse. In the Netherlands, people always feel that they have to tell you what they want to say, so they'll tell you, no matter. Like you can be at the bakery and be like ordering something, and somebody will start talking to the back of your head about what they have to say to you. In Norway, that doesn't happen, thankfully. But so that makes it for me safe, simply to be out and have an attitude about it. And so then I'm like, I can proudly say like, yeah, queer type, blah, blah, blah. Like, I don't know that my type is queer. The attitude with which I sell it is, the attitude with which I package it, the whole framework for me of what my type is supposed to do, that is in a place for me comes from my own queerness, which is a stubborn refusal to submit to standards in the type field. Like everything has to have at least 18 styles, and ideally you have 5 widths, etc., etc., etc. And I disagree, and I stubbornly stand up against it. And that, in that way, is like queer as in punk queer. But I think the problem is that there's a lot of people that don't want to share that. And so if you ever want to find out more about that, I think you should have conversations with people, because people will not publicly share that. Even though I know plenty of people around the scene. So
I have the person who asked this says, and I found this really powerful. The person who asked this says, "I am one, and I didn't know you work, and it matters so much to me." And I think this is very important. Is that because you could actually make a stand and say, "I will purposefully amplify the voice and purchase the work of queer people to put them more to the forefront." And it's not, I don't know if it's an ideological stand, but just to make sure, like, all right, people, some sections of the population are underrepresented, but they are there and they need to be visible so that other people see them and accept all the differences, and also see that the whole spectrum is much wider than they would expect. So Bianca, I would say, like, get in touch with Robin, and maybe if you do personal connections, you will be able to find more work by trans people and queer people, and then it's a whole world that needs to be known, and you can purposefully support their work and amplify their voice and make it more visible. So this is really nice. So hold on. Okay, I know that's not a question. This is a bit a funny talk. Yeah, whatever. I mean, this is the first online experience of ATypI. It's been great so far. I'm seeing no other questions. Honestly, Robin, I could go on and on. This was a great talk, and it's fascinating to talk to you. What I would suggest, we're 20 to 7. So I have to get ready for another session, but people, we have the Hangout room. Hangout room is where everybody can show up. There are people that are just sitting with their camera on, waiting for something to happen. At some point, there's like 4 people just doing their work. At some other point, there's people giving career advice, doing ad hoc mentoring, showing pre-releases. And there's also the ideal place to continue the conversation. So if people have, oh, hold on, I have one more question. Somebody woke up. Okay, let's do this last one question, and then I suggest everybody head over to the Hangout room. And if you want to continue, do you still have some time, Robin, to share with the audience?
I will also drop into the Hangout room for another like whenever we're done here.
So I'm going to ask you the last question. Oh, there was a question about the classification Vox, and Manuel Sesma is going to do a talk about unvoxing the type classification.
Oh, good.
So removing all those names of the heroes, and also because the whole Vox classification is problematic because it's so squarely focused on just the Latin and then the traditional categories. Sorry, I can write it. I must sometimes mispronounce it. So what we want to do is like rip this whole thing out and redistribute this whole classifications in. So if you're interested in these topics, tomorrow Manuel Sesma unboxing the type classification. So one last question, and then we move over to the Hangout, and that is. David Ross
Here we go.
Is asking, how do you go about citing your sources for translational designs when you put your own spin on existing work? When is source material worth a reference in the font name, a mention in the font bio, a link, or an image?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I are on the side of over-crediting others. Because I've seen an awful lot of people in the field, and maybe I'm probably overcorrecting way the wrong way. I've seen an awful lot of people in the field over the years who will say, here's a thing I came up with. Here's a font. Here's a great idea. Here's your cool display typeface. The R has like a really funky little wave in it, and I came up with it. Isn't that amazing? It's like based on some guideline I once saw or something. And then I think, no, I saw that too. It was by Eric Gill. It's really famous sign painting guideline. Weird that you would credit it as like this nebulous, unknowable cultural artifact, when in fact in that case it is explicitly placed in the hands of like an object that clearly was the source. In fact, there are so many things in there that are straight up that. Then there have been other takes of the exact same source, all equally, how would we say that kindly? That are all
let it rip. Come
on. they're all just being they're all presuming that you've already read about it, so they don't have to say it. We don't have to say where this came from. You probably know this one already, and so they're selling it as what to me is this like stolen valor thing. Like I said, like this like greatness by association. Like, are you reviving this so you can claim that you came up with it? Like, that's weird to me. I feel like there's something of that, and maybe I'm overcorrecting. Maybe I'm overcorrecting by pointing to the sources that I've had when I'm working from it. But I feel like there's a transformative art in recognizing what you're translating. Like there's a great Radiolab episode recommended. Here's do you have a jingle for this? Anybody on the soundboard? A jingle for Robin's recommended corner. Radiolab episode about translations, which is highly recommended, and it came out in July or August. And they talk about a guy who has been translating a French poem for the past 20 years or something.